What if the most damaging thing said in this courtroom wasn't written by a journalist, but by Prince Harry himself? That's the thought that hangs in the air before anyone even sits down, before the legal teams shuffle their papers, before the judge looks up, before a single word is read into the record. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because on the surface, this is supposed to be a familiar story. Another chapter in a long, bitter war between Prince Harry and the British press. Another attempt to hold newspapers accountable for what he says were years of unlawful intrusion. Phone hacking, surveillance, lives pulled apart for headlines. We've heard versions of this before, many times, but something feels different this time. Quieter, more unsettled. Harry isn't here just to talk about articles and paparazzi. He's here to talk about relationships, about trust, about how the press, in his words, had a snowball effect that damaged and ultimately destroyed the women he loved. And that's where the story starts to slip out of his control. Because once you move the argument away from headlines and into the private space between two people, you invite scrutiny of something else entirely. Not what the press did, but what was said behind closed doors. What was written casually. What was never meant to be seen. What was never meant to be read aloud in court. The courtroom itself is unremarkable in the way official rooms often are. Neutral, controlled, designed to drain emotion rather than amplify it. And yet, there are moments when even a room like this can't absorb what's unfolding. This is one of those moments. Harry speaks about paranoia, about feeling watched, about how every call, every message, every moment of intimacy felt exposed. He describes the sense that nothing was sacred, that the press had turned his private life into public property, and that the women closest to him paid the price. It feels creepy, he says in his statement. Like you can't trust anyone. Like every aspect of your life is being displayed for amusement and money. It's a compelling image. A young man raised in a goldfish bowl, trying to build adult relationships under relentless scrutiny. Many in the room nod along. It makes sense. It fits the narrative people already know. But then the case pivots. Not loudly, not dramatically. It pivots the way serious stories often do. With paperwork. With a pause. With a decision that once made, can't be undone. Because the court isn't just hearing about intrusion anymore. It's being handed something else. Something far more personal. Screenshots of private text messages. Messages exchanged years ago. Messages that were never published. Never leaked to the tabloids. Never turned into headlines. Until now. And the woman who provides them is not a journalist. Not a former employee. Not a tabloid fixer. It's Chelsy Davy. That alone is enough to change the temperature in the room. Chelsy Davy has spent most of her adult life doing the one thing people rarely get credit for, staying quiet. She didn't monetize her relationship. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on television to explain her side. For years, she was treated as a footnote in Harry's story. The girlfriend who couldn't handle the pressure. The one who walked away. That framing has gone largely unchallenged. Until now. Because when Harry tells the court that the press destroyed his relationship with Chelsy, he's making a claim not just about newspapers, but about history itself. He's asking the court to accept that narrative as truth. And Chelsy, by handing over these messages, isn't attacking him. She isn't grandstanding. She isn't even contradicting him directly. She's doing something much more destabilizing. She's adding context. Harry explains that because Chelsy lived in South Africa, most of their relationship happened over phones and texts. That they shared private thoughts, intimate conversations. That trust was essential. He says he trusted her with everything. And she trusted him too. That's what makes the messages matter. Because trust cuts both ways. The messages don't scream. They don't rant. They don't read like something written in anger. That's part of what makes them uncomfortable. They're casual, offhand. The kind of things people write when they think no one else will ever see them. Sarcasm, dismissiveness, a tone that doesn't quite align with the version of events being described under oath. And then there's the line. The one that lands in the courtroom with a thud so soft you almost miss it. She's a rebound anyway. It's not presented as a headline. It's not even emphasized. It's just there. In the middle of a conversation. Referring to Meghan Markle, before she was Meghan Markle the public figure. Before the engagement. Before the speeches about destiny and protection and love against all odds. Before everything. And suddenly, the story isn't as clean as it was a few minutes ago. Because if Harry was mocking Meghan privately while still emotionally tethered to Chelsy, what does that do to the claim that the press alone destroyed his relationships? That's not an accusation. It's a question, and it's a dangerous one. The legal case itself is aimed at Associated Newspapers, the publisher behind the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. Harry alleges unlawful information gathering, phone hacking, tracking Chelsy's movements, turning her life upside down once their relationship became public in 2004. He says her life as she knew it was over. And there's truth there. Anyone paying attention back then knows how relentless the coverage was. Chelsy was followed, photographed, judged, reduced to a role she never asked for. But the presence of these texts introduces a parallel truth, one that doesn't erase press intrusion, but complicates the idea that it was the sole force at work. Harry talks about becoming careful, suspicious, paranoid, about how the pressure made him pull back emotionally, how he started to second-guess everything. And again, that makes sense. Trauma often does that. It narrows your world. It convinces you that danger is everywhere. But trauma also changes how you treat the people closest to you. And that's where the story slows down. Because this isn't about whether Harry suffered. That part is clear. This is about whether suffering explains everything, or whether it's sometimes used to explain too much. As the courtroom listens, something else becomes apparent. These messages were not hacked. They were not stolen. They were not obtained through unlawful means. They were preserved, held onto, and only brought forward when Harry's own testimony made them relevant. That distinction matters, because it means the most revealing material in this case doesn't come from the very press Harry is fighting. It comes from within his own past. From a relationship he says he valued. From a woman he says he trusted. So why now? That's the question no one asks out loud, but everyone is thinking. Why would Chelsy allow these messages into evidence after all these years of silence? The easy answer is legal necessity. Harry's claims about how and why the relationship ended invite scrutiny. When one side tells a story under oath, the other side has the right to test it. But there's a quieter answer too, one that's harder to dismiss. Silence only works when it doesn't distort the truth. And for years, the narrative has been simple. Harry loved Chelsy, but the press made it impossible. Full stop. The text suggests something messier. Not cruel, not malicious, just human. Ambivalent, unsettled, emotionally divided. And that kind of messiness doesn't play well in myth-making. Harry's public identity has increasingly centered on moral clarity, on drawing lines between good and bad actors, on telling a story where harm comes from the outside, not from within. But private messages rarely conform to public narratives. They capture people mid-thought, mid-doubt, mid-contradiction. They capture who someone was before they knew who they needed to become. And once they're in evidence, they can't be unheard. As Harry continues his testimony, he returns to the idea of the snowball effect. How stories piled on stories. How pressure mounted until relationships buckled under the weight. But snowballs don't roll downhill by themselves. They need a slope. They need momentum. And the question the court doesn't answer, but the audience can't ignore, is whether some of that momentum came from inside the relationship itself. Were the press stories the cause? Or were they accelerants? Were they the spark? Or did they land on something already fragile? That distinction doesn't absolve newspapers of wrongdoing, but it does change how responsibility is distributed. And responsibility is what this case is quietly circling around. Not legal responsibility alone. Emotional responsibility. Narrative responsibility. The responsibility that comes with telling your story in a way that freezes other people in time, while allowing yourself to evolve. Chelsy Davy never asked to be a witness in Harry's war with the press. But once he framed her as evidence of its damage, she was pulled back into the story whether she liked it or not. And instead of speaking, she let the messages speak. That choice is what makes this moment so unsettling. Because texts don't perform. They don't posture. They don't adjust to the room. They just exist. And now, they exist in a courtroom. The judge listens. The lawyers listen. Harry listens. And for perhaps the first time in this case, the narrative isn't moving forward. It's folding back on itself, revealing layers that were never meant to be exposed. Because if the press didn't invent these words, if they didn't twist them, if they didn't publish them, then what exactly is being put on trial here? The newspapers? Or the story Harry has been telling about himself for years? And as the court adjourns for the day, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This case isn't just about unlawful information gathering anymore. It's about whether the most consequential damage to Harry's relationships came from strangers with cameras or from things he once typed casually, never imagining they would one day be read back to him under oath. And once that door opens, it doesn't stop with Chelsy. Because she wasn't the only woman who felt the strain. And she wasn't the only relationship that ended under a cloud of suspicion, pressure, and unfinished truths. But what came next would pull another name into the light and expose a pattern that's far harder to explain away. The shift doesn't happen with a bang. There's no gasp, no audible reaction, just a subtle recalibration in the room, the kind that experienced court reporters recognize instantly. This is no longer a case moving in a straight line. This is a case bending. Because once the texts are acknowledged as real, once it's clear they weren't hacked or lifted from some shadowy source, the entire architecture of the argument changes. The courtroom stops being a place where the press is examined from a distance and becomes a place where Prince Harry himself is quietly, methodically brought closer to the center of the frame. And that's where Chapter 1 really begins. Harry takes the stand again, this time not just as a victim of intrusion, but as a narrator whose timeline is being gently tested. Not aggressively, not with theatrics, with patience. That's what makes it unnerving. Because the questions aren't accusatory. They're clarifying. They ask him to explain how his relationships functioned, how communication worked, how trust was built and broken, how suspicion crept in. And at first, Harry answers the way he always has. With conviction, with emotion, with the language of someone who has told this story many times. He describes a life lived under siege, a constant sense of being watched, of never knowing who to trust. He talks about how that pressure seeped into his relationships, turning intimacy into risk. He says he became careful, guarded. That paranoia changed him. And again, none of that sounds implausible. In fact, it sounds familiar. What's different is the context now sitting silently on the table. The texts don't interrupt him. They don't contradict him outright. They just wait. The legal team lets Harry speak. They let him build the emotional scaffolding of his experience. They let him describe how the press, particularly stories published by the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday, created what he calls a snowball effect. One story feeding another, amplifying scrutiny, increasing strain. It's a powerful metaphor, one Harry has used before. But metaphors become less stable when specifics enter the room. The questions shift slightly, not to what the press did, but to how Harry responded, how he communicated during this period, how he spoke about the people he loved. And that's where things tighten. Harry explains that because his then-girlfriend lived abroad, communication happened primarily through calls and texts. He emphasizes trust again. He says those messages were private, that they contained thoughts and feelings never meant for anyone else. There's a pause here, a noticeable one, because privacy cuts both ways. If these communications were sacred, then their content matters. Not just the fact that they existed, but what they reveal about the emotional climate of the relationship at the time. The court isn't interested in humiliating Harry. That's not the aim. The aim is to assess whether his claim that press intrusion was the primary cause of relational breakdown can stand without qualification. And that's where the contradiction starts to surface. When asked about overlapping timelines, Harry is careful. He doesn't deny meeting new people while still emotionally connected to old relationships. He frames it as complexity, as confusion, as the natural messiness of young adulthood lived under extraordinary circumstances. Again, reasonable. But the texts don't live in abstraction. They live in moments. Moments where tone matters, where phrasing matters, where what is said, and how casually it's said, tells a story that's harder to align with a single external villain. One of the messages is read. Not dramatically, just read. It's not cruel. That's what surprises people. It's flippant, almost dismissive. A sentence typed quickly, likely without much thought, referring to someone who would later become his wife. She's a rebound anyway. The room doesn't react the way you'd expect. There's no audible intake of breath. But something changes. You can feel it in the way people stop writing and start listening. Because this isn't a statement made to the press. It's not a quote pulled out of context. It's not even something meant to persuade. It's offhand. And offhand remarks are often the most revealing. The legal team doesn't pounce. They don't editorialize. They simply ask Harry to explain the context, what he meant, how he felt at the time. Harry answers. He says relationships are complicated, that labels don't always capture emotional reality, that he was navigating uncertainty. And that may be true, but here's where the tension sharpens. If Harry privately minimized the seriousness of a new relationship while still emotionally bound to an old one, then the narrative that the press alone forced his hand becomes less complete. Not false, just incomplete. The court is not deciding whether Harry is a good person. That's important to understand. It's deciding whether his explanation of events holds under scrutiny. And scrutiny is not the same as hostility. As questioning continues, Harry returns repeatedly to the idea of paranoia. He says he describes the emotional toll of living in that state, of pulling back, of second-guessing every interaction. But there's a subtle shift in how those words land now. Because paranoia can explain withdrawal. It can explain caution. But it doesn't automatically explain dismissiveness. It doesn't fully account for tone. And tone is what the texts quietly introduce into evidence. The court doesn't say this explicitly. It doesn't need to. The implication hangs there, unspoken. Was Harry pulling away because of the press? Or was he already pulling away, with the press simply providing a convenient explanation? That question doesn't accuse. It probes. And probing questions are harder to deflect than attacks. At one point, Harry emphasizes how deeply he cared about protecting the women he loved from the spotlight. How he felt responsible for the pain they experienced once their relationships became public. There's sincerity there. You can hear it. Even critics acknowledge it. But sincerity doesn't always equal consistency. Because protection can sometimes look like control. And withdrawal can sometimes look like indifference, especially to the person on the receiving end. The texts don't show malice, but they do show distance. Emotional hedging. A reluctance to fully commit while still benefiting from intimacy. And that's where the snowball effect metaphor starts to wobble. Snowballs imply inevitability, momentum beyond control. A small thing growing larger through external forces. But relationships rarely end because of one force alone. They erode, quietly, incrementally, through misunderstandings, mismatched expectations, and unspoken doubts. The court isn't saying the press didn't intrude. It's asking whether that intrusion explains everything Harry attributes to it. And Harry, perhaps sensing this shift, doubles down on the emotional impact. He describes feeling unsafe, feeling hunted, feeling that the women he loved were targeted simply for being close to him. He says he became suspicious not just of the press, but of people around him. Friends, acquaintances, even partners. That admission lands differently now. Because suspicion, once internalized, doesn't discriminate. It corrodes intimacy. It turns reassurance into performance. It makes trust conditional. And if you're in a relationship with someone who suspects leaks everywhere, that suspicion doesn't stay abstract. It shows up in conversations, in tone, in what's said, and what's withheld. The legal team doesn't need to spell this out. The audience can feel it. Harry is describing a man under siege. The texts show a man hedging his bets. Both can be true at the same time. And that coexistence is what complicates the case. As the questioning winds down, there's no dramatic confrontation. No moment where Harry is caught out. That's not how this unfolds. Instead, there's something quieter, more destabilizing. Harry realizes, perhaps for the first time in a legal setting, that his story is no longer the only authoritative account of his past relationships. The texts exist independently of his testimony. They don't argue. They don't explain themselves. They simply sit there, immutable. And once they're in evidence, they belong to the record. That's when the case truly changes. Because the fight is no longer just about what newspapers did wrong. It's about whether Harry's account of relational harm is being told in full or selectively framed. That's a dangerous place for any public figure to be, especially one who has built his moral authority on the idea of truth-telling. As the session ends, the judge thanks everyone. Formalities resume. The room exhales. But no one leaves unaffected. Because this wasn't a decisive day. It didn't deliver a verdict. It delivered doubt. Not the kind that destroys a case outright. The kind that lingers. That forces reconsideration. That invites deeper examination. And as people file out, one thing becomes clear. If these texts were allowed into evidence for one relationship, then the logic doesn't stop there. Because patterns don't exist in isolation. And once the court begins to see repetition, similar suspicions, similar withdrawals, similar endings, the focus naturally widens. Which brings another name back into the conversation. A shorter relationship. Less documented. Easier to dismiss. Until it isn't. Because if Harry suspected leaks there too, if the same dynamics played out, then the question becomes unavoidable. Is this a story about a man destroyed by the press? Or about a man whose fear of the press slowly dismantled his own relationships from the inside? And that question doesn't wait politely for an answer. It pulls the next chapter into view. One that introduces a familiar pattern, a different woman, and a breakup that suddenly looks far less isolated than it once did. Because once you start seeing the repetition, it's impossible to unsee. And what comes next forces the court and the audience to confront whether this is about intrusion at all or about something much closer to home. But that realization would only fully land when another relationship entered the frame. One Harry rarely talks about now, but which ended under strikingly similar circumstances. And that's where the story turns again. It starts with a question that sounds almost unfair until you sit with it. If the press really was the single destructive force in Prince Harry's relationships, why does the same pattern keep reappearing even when the spotlight is smaller, the relationship shorter, the coverage thinner? That's not a hostile question. It's an analytical one. And it's the question that quietly ushers another name back into the room. Not with fanfare, not with nostalgia, but with relevance. Because once the court begins to examine repetition, it can't ignore Natalie Pinkham. This is where the story becomes more uncomfortable, precisely because it's less dramatic. There are no long timelines here. No decade-spanning relationship. No grand love story cut short. What Harry describes as brief. Early 2000s. Casual, by comparison. Something that might otherwise have faded into obscurity. And yet, it ends the same way. That's the problem. Harry tells the court that his relationship with Natalie Pinkham deteriorated because he suspected stories about them were being leaked to the press. He says he felt the same creeping paranoia, the same sense of being watched, the same fear that private moments were becoming public currency. Listen to that carefully. This relationship wasn't defined by relentless tabloid obsession in the way his later ones were. Natalie Pinkham was a television presenter, not a private citizen pulled suddenly into royal orbit. The coverage existed, yes, but it wasn't overwhelming. And yet, Harry's internal response was the same. Suspicion, withdrawal, the belief that someone, somewhere, was talking. That repetition is subtle, but it matters. Because patterns don't require identical circumstances to reveal themselves. They require consistent responses. Harry doesn't accuse Natalie directly. He's careful about that. He doesn't say she leaked stories. He says he suspected that information was getting out, that he couldn't trace the source, that the uncertainty itself became corrosive. And uncertainty, once introduced, is rarely contained. Here's the thing about suspicion. It doesn't need proof to do damage. It only needs plausibility. And in Harry's world, plausibility is everywhere. The court listens as Harry explains how even brief relationships were affected by this climate. How he began to see press intrusion not as a possibility, but as a constant. But as this unfolds, the earlier messages linger in the background, unspoken, but present. Because those texts showed Harry already hedging emotionally, already distancing himself privately, already framing new relationships with casual dismissiveness. So when he describes suspicion ending things with Natalie Pinkham, the audience is now primed to ask a harder question. Was suspicion the cause? Or was it the justification? That distinction is uncomfortable because it suggests agency. Not malicious intent, but choice. Choice in how to interpret events. Choice in how much doubt to allow. Choice in whether to confront concerns or retreat from them. Harry frames his withdrawal as self-protection, as a necessary response to an environment that felt unsafe. And again, that explanation holds weight. But the court isn't weighing emotional plausibility alone. It's weighing consistency. If multiple relationships of different lengths, intensities, and public profiles all end under the same explanation, then the explanation itself becomes part of the story. And that's when the narrative quietly shifts from what happened to Harry to how Harry responds when pressure appears. That's a very different inquiry. It doesn't deny that pressure exists. It examines its effects. Harry talks about feeling unable to relax, unable to trust, unable to be fully present. He says every interaction felt loaded with risk. But the audience, having now seen the texts, hears something else layered underneath. Emotional preemption, the instinct to pull back before being hurt, to frame relationships as temporary before they become vulnerable, to soften exits by attributing them to external forces rather than internal uncertainty. None of that is villainous. It's human, but it does complicate the narrative of total external blame. The legal team doesn't dwell on Natalie Pinkham for long. They don't need to. Her presence isn't meant to dominate the case. It's meant to contextualize it. She functions as a data point, a confirmation that what happened with Chelsy Davy wasn't unique. And uniqueness matters in court. Because unique events can be attributed to extraordinary circumstances. Repeated events demand explanation. Harry's testimony reveals a man who experienced fame as threat, not privilege, who experienced attention as invasion, who learned early that trust had consequences. That mindset doesn't disappear when a relationship ends. It carries forward. So when Harry says the press destroyed his relationships, what he may be describing, without realizing it, is how his relationship with the press reshaped his approach to intimacy itself. That's a subtle but profound difference. The court isn't interested in diagnosing Harry. It's interested in causality. Did unlawful information gathering directly in these relationships? Or did it create a psychological environment in which Harry preemptively withdrew, suspected, and disengaged, thereby accelerating their collapse? That question sits uncomfortably between sympathy and scrutiny. And it doesn't require the press to be innocent for it to matter. Because even if tabloids behaved unlawfully, that doesn't mean they controlled every outcome. As this realization settles in, Harry's testimony takes on a different tone. Not weaker, more exposed. The audience begins to notice how often he describes emotional distance as protection, how often he frames retreat as necessity. And suddenly, the texts make even more sense. Dismissiveness becomes a shield. Sarcasm becomes insulation. Calling someone a rebound isn't just casual cruelty. It's emotional minimization, a way of keeping stakes low when you don't feel safe raising them. Seen through that lens, the texts aren't shocking because they're cruel. They're unsettling because they're defensive, and defense mechanisms repeat. That's what makes Natalie Pinkham's brief appearance in this case so significant. She's not here to accuse. She's not here to testify. She's here as evidence of recurrence. As proof that the snowball Harry describes may not have been rolling downhill entirely on its own. As the session moves on, the court doesn't resolve this tension. It doesn't need to. It plants it. And that planted doubt grows quietly. Because if Harry's fear of the press shaped his behavior across multiple relationships, then the narrative of pure victimhood becomes more complex. Not false. Incomplete. And incomplete stories are dangerous in court. As observers leave the courtroom that day, conversations shift. Not about phone hacking. Not about legal statutes. But about pattern. About how trauma reproduces itself. About how someone can be both harmed and harmful, without intending to be either. And about what happens when private defenses become public evidence. Because the more the court hears, the clearer it becomes that Chelsy Davy's texts weren't an anomaly. They were a window. And now that window is open, it's letting in a draft that reaches far beyond one relationship, one woman, or one set of messages. It's reaching towards something much more sensitive. The evolution of a narrative. Because the next phase of this story isn't about ex-girlfriends anymore. It's about how a public figure's private self gets rewritten, and whether that rewriting is honest. And that reckoning doesn't stay in the past. It moves forward. Toward the woman who eventually became Harry's wife. Toward the version of love that was presented as destiny. Toward the mythology that was built after the fact, and the early doubts that never quite fit inside it. Because before Meghan Markle became a cause, a symbol, a lightning rod, she was just another person being described in private. And once the court turns its attention there, the implications grow far more explosive than anyone in that room initially expected. Before Meghan Markle became a symbol, she was a sentence in a text message. That's the thought that's hardest to shake once the court's attention drifts, inevitably, in her direction. Not because anyone is accusing her of anything. Not because she's on trial. She isn't. But because once private language enters public record, it has a way of rearranging timelines and meanings. And this is where the story becomes most delicate. Because we are no longer talking about how relationships ended. We are talking about how they began. Or more precisely, how they were framed when no one was listening. Up to this point, the courtroom has been orbiting past relationships. Chelsy, Natalie, patterns, repetition, emotional withdrawal explained as self-defense, suspicion framed as survival. But now the lens turns forward, toward the relationship that didn't collapse under pressure, but instead became the foundation of a global narrative about love, persecution, and escape, toward Meghan Markle. The shift is subtle, almost reluctant. No one announces it. No one needs to. It's there in the logic of the case. If Harry's private words mattered when discussing why earlier relationships failed, then they mattered just as much when examining how this one took shape. And that's where the discomfort deepens. Because the text messages don't describe a grand romance unfolding. They don't hint at destiny. They don't sound like a man who has met the one and knows it instantly. They sound like someone hedging. She's a rebound anyway. That line, or one very close to it, sits uncomfortably between past and future. It doesn't insult. It minimizes. It reduces emotional risk by lowering emotional stakes. And context matters here. This wasn't written after a clean break. It wasn't written from a place of emotional closure. It was written while Harry was still tethered, emotionally, psychologically, to his previous relationship. That doesn't make him unique. It makes him human. But it does complicate the story he would later tell about how and why this relationship emerged. Because public narratives thrive on clarity, private lives rarely provide it. In the years since Harry and Meghan went public, their story has been framed as inevitable. As two people drawn together by shared values, shared wounds, shared opposition to a hostile press. A love forged under fire. And again, parts of that are undeniably true. The press reaction to Meghan was brutal, racially charged, invasive, often indefensible. But the court is not weighing the morality of tabloids right now. It's weighing causality and credibility. And the early private framing of Meghan as emotionally provisional, a rebound, introduces a question that no amount of later devotion can fully erase. When did the story change? Was the transformation gradual, organic, sincere? Or was it accelerated by pressure? By the same press dynamics Harry now says destroyed his earlier relationships? That question isn't meant to diminish the marriage. It's meant to interrogate the narrative architecture built around it. Because if Harry's fear of the press pushed him away from earlier partners, what did it push him toward here? The court doesn't answer that. It doesn't even ask it directly. But the logic is unavoidable. If pressure leads to withdrawal in one context, it can lead to fusion in another. Trauma doesn't just create distance. Sometimes it creates urgency. Sometimes it encourages people to cling harder, faster, more completely, especially when the world feels hostile. Seen through that lens, the early dismissiveness in the text doesn't negate the later intensity. It foreshadows it. It suggests a man moving from emotional caution to emotional acceleration, from minimization to mythology. And mythology is powerful. It organizes chaos. It turns confusion into purpose. It reframes uncertainty as fate. That's not an accusation. It's an observation. As the court proceedings continue, no one reads more texts about Meghan. They don't need to. That single framing line has already done its work. It has introduced doubt, not about love, but about timing, about sequence, about how stories evolve once they're told often enough. Harry's public retelling of his relationship with Meghan has emphasized instant connection, deep understanding, and shared opposition to intrusion. Those themes resonate. They make sense in hindsight. But hindsight is always cleaner than reality. Reality, as captured in private messages, is uneven, hesitant, sometimes contradictory. And that's what makes this moment so destabilizing. Because the court isn't saying Harry didn't love Meghan. It's asking whether his explanation for why earlier relationships failed, the press, can coexist with evidence that he was already emotionally disengaging before the press could have done all the damage he claims. If he was privately hedging, minimizing, distancing, then the press didn't create those dynamics. It may have amplified them. That distinction matters legally, but it matters even more narratively. Because Harry's public authority, his moral clarity, rests on the idea that he is telling a story others refuse to tell honestly. The presence of these texts doesn't prove dishonesty. It proves selectivity. And selectivity is where trust begins to erode. Not just in court, with the audience. As observers process this, reactions diverge. Some see the texts as youthful thoughtlessness. Others see them as evidence of emotional inconsistency. Most see something more complicated. A man trying to navigate overlapping emotional worlds under extreme scrutiny, without the tools to do so cleanly. That complexity doesn't fit neatly into slogans. And it certainly doesn't fit into legal arguments built on singular causation. The court doesn't need to resolve the meaning of that text. It only needs to acknowledge its existence. Because once acknowledged, it undermines the idea that Harry's private and public narratives were always aligned. And that misalignment raises a broader question, one that reaches far beyond this case. If Harry's war with the press is also, in part, a war over narrative control, then what happens when elements of that narrative escape his authorship? What happens when someone else's silence ends? Chelsy Davy didn't speak. She didn't editorialize. She let the messages exist. That archive doesn't attack Meghan. It doesn't villainize Harry. It simply reminds everyone that before the mythology hardened, there was uncertainty. Before the speeches, there were texts. Before the narrative, there was ambivalence. And once ambivalence enters the record, it doesn't stay contained. Because it invites comparison. Between what was said then and what is said now. Between how relationships were described privately and how they are defended publicly. Between vulnerability and performance. As the court adjourns again, the legal focus remains on unlawful information gathering, on phone hacking, on whether publishers crossed legal lines. But the emotional center of gravity has shifted. This is no longer just a case about newspapers behaving badly. It's about how trauma reshapes storytelling, how fear becomes identity, how personal history is edited, sometimes unconsciously, into a cleaner arc. And how that arc begins to crack when private words reappear at the wrong moment. Because the most unsettling thing about these texts isn't what they say about Meghan. It's what they reveal about Harry. A man caught between past and future, between detachment and devotion, between self-protection and self-mythologizing. And once that tension is visible, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why did these messages surface now? Why did silence last this long? And what does it mean when the most consequential evidence in a privacy case wasn't stolen, leaked, or hacked, but handed over voluntarily after years of restraint? That question doesn't point backward. It points forward, toward motive, toward timing, toward the possibility that this case isn't just about what the press did, but about who finally decided that the story being told no longer matched the truth they lived with. And when that realization settles in, the focus shifts again, away from relationships and toward intention. Because evidence doesn't emerge randomly. It appears when something has reached its breaking point. And the reason for that breaking point is where the story goes next. Evidence doesn't drift into courtrooms by accident. That's the realization that settles in once you stop reacting to the content of the messages and start thinking about their timing. Because the most consequential question now isn't what was written years ago. It's why those words are being read aloud now. Not leaked, not sold, not splashed across a front page. Submitted, deliberately, after years of silence. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this case. Up until this point, the narrative tension has lived in the past. In who said what, in how relationships ended, in whether the press caused harm or merely accelerated it. But the moment Chelsy Davy's texts enter the record, the story shifts from memory to motive. Why now? Why, after more than a decade of restraint, does this material suddenly become relevant? The easy answer is legal necessity. Harry put his relationships at the center of his claim. He testified that press intrusion destroyed them. Once that claim was made under oath, the defense had the right to test it. That's true, but it's not sufficient. Because legal necessity doesn't explain consent. It doesn't explain why Chelsy agreed to let deeply private communications be scrutinized publicly. Communications that could just as easily reopen old wounds for her. She had nothing to gain financially. No platform to promote. No book coming out. No brand to protect or launch. If anything, staying silent would have been easier. Silence had worked for her before. So why break it now? The courtroom doesn't ask this directly. Courts rarely interrogate emotional motive unless it's legally relevant. But the audience does. Observers do. And once the question forms, it doesn't go away. Because Chelsy Davy has spent years being described without speaking. Her relationship with Harry has been framed almost entirely through his lens, as a casualty of the press, a love that couldn't survive intrusion. That story has calcified into accepted truth. And accepted truths become dangerous when they're incomplete. What the texts introduce isn't an alternative narrative so much as a missing dimension. They don't accuse Harry of cruelty. They don't recast him as a villain. They simply demonstrate that his private emotional posture was more complex, more guarded, more ambivalent than his public testimony suggests. And once that gap exists, silence becomes distortion. That's the quiet, ethical line this moment sits on. Chelsy didn't step forward to contradict Harry's pain. She stepped forward because his account had begun to override her experience. There's a difference. For years, her silence allowed Harry's narrative to stand unchallenged. But when that narrative entered a courtroom, when it hardened into sworn testimony, silence stopped being neutral. It became complicit. And that's often when people speak. Not out of spite, out of correction. The court doesn't frame it this way. But emotionally, that's what's happening. A recalibration. A reminder that shared history cannot be owned by one voice alone. The legal team treats the texts with restraint. They don't sensationalize them. They don't quote them endlessly. They understand their power lies in their existence, not in repetition. And the judge understands something else. This case is not just about whether newspapers cross legal lines. It's about credibility, about proportionality, about whether Harry's account of relational harm accurately reflects the full context of those relationships. And context is cumulative. One set of texts might be dismissed as youthful flippancy. Two might be coincidence. Three begin to suggest pattern. And pattern is what the court is quietly assembling. The texts don't stand alone. They sit alongside Harry's testimony about Natalie Pinkham, alongside his descriptions of paranoia, suspicion, and withdrawal, alongside his insistence that press intrusion was the dominant force shaping his emotional life. What emerges isn't contradiction so much as tension, between agency and victimhood, between fear and control, between public narrative and private behavior. Harry's case depends on causality, on proving that unlawful information gathering caused specific harms. And causality is rarely clean when human relationships are involved. The presence of these messages introduces alternative explanations, not replacements, alternatives. That's enough to weaken absolutist claims. And absolutist claims are fragile under cross-examination. As the days pass, observers notice something else. Harry's language becomes more careful, more qualified. He begins to acknowledge complexity more openly. He doesn't retreat from his claims, but he softens their edges. That shift doesn't come from being confronted aggressively. It comes from realizing that his story is no longer the only record of events. And that realization is destabilizing. Because for years, Harry has positioned himself as a truth-teller, someone finally exposing the mechanisms of harm others refuse to confront. His authority comes from moral clarity, from drawing sharp lines between right and wrong. But moral clarity is difficult to maintain when private ambiguity enters evidence. The court isn't punishing Harry for that ambiguity. It's weighing it. And weighing is different from judging. Still, the impact is undeniable. The case now contains two competing archives. One is public, articles, photographs, headlines, published narratives. The other is private, texts, tone, offhand remarks, emotional hedging. Harry's argument rests on the harm caused by the first. Chelsy's texts remind everyone that the second existed simultaneously. That coexistence doesn't absolve the press, but it does complicate the claim that the press alone dictated outcomes. And that complication is enough to shift the balance of sympathy. Not entirely, but perceptibly. As this sinks in, another question surfaces, one the court never needs to ask, but which the audience cannot avoid. Why did Harry choose to frame his relationships this way? Why center them so heavily in a legal case about privacy? There were other arguments available, other harms to emphasize, other evidence to foreground. But Harry chose relationships. He chose emotional damage. He chose intimacy as proof. That choice invited intimacy back into the courtroom. And once invited, it doesn't behave predictably. Intimacy resists simplification. It reveals contradictions. It exposes defenses. It shows how people manage fear. Sometimes by retreating, sometimes by reframing, sometimes by rewriting their own past. None of that makes Harry dishonest, but it does make him human in a way that undermines the mythic clarity of his public role. The myth depends on a clean arc: innocent love, external persecution, righteous escape. The texts suggest a Messier reality: overlapping emotions, defensive minimization, uncertainty coexisting with affection. That messiness doesn't sell well. It doesn't rally movements. It doesn't translate easily into activism or litigation. But it's closer to the truth most people recognize in their own lives. And that recognition is uncomfortable, because it forces the audience to confront a more nuanced possibility: that Harry can be both deeply harmed by the press and partially responsible for how his relationships unfolded. That fear can be both justified and distorting. That victimhood and agency are not mutually exclusive. The court doesn't resolve this. Courts rarely resolve psychological complexity. They assess legal thresholds. But the damage, or rather, the disruption, has already occurred. The narrative Harry brought into the courtroom has been altered, not overturned. Altered. And alteration is often more consequential than contradiction. As the proceedings move forward, the legal focus will return to statutes, to evidence of unlawful information gathering, to whether publishers crossed lines defined by law. But the audience will carry something else with them: the knowledge that the most revealing evidence in this case did not come from the press. It came from a woman who stayed silent until silence no longer felt honest. And that knowledge changes how everything else is heard. Because if Chelsy Davy felt compelled to correct the record, not publicly, but legally, then the question of intention looms larger. Not malicious intention, narrative intention. Who gets to define what destroyed a relationship? Who gets to decide which forces mattered most? And what happens when the answer to those questions becomes shared rather than singular? That's where this story is heading now, away from the past and toward accountability. Not legal accountability alone, narrative accountability. Because once multiple truths exist side by side, the era of clean storytelling ends. And what comes next is not resolution. It's reckoning. But that reckoning doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds through consequences, through reactions, through the realization that once private words become public record, they don't just affect one case. They reshape the way an entire story is told. And that reshaping has only just begun. The reckoning doesn't arrive with a verdict. It never does. It arrives in smaller, quieter ways, in how questions are framed, in what is no longer said with certainty, in the subtle retreat from absolutes. By the time the court reconvenes, something fundamental has shifted. Not in the law, in the story. Up to now, this case has been narrated as a battle between a man and an institution. Prince Harry versus the press. Privacy versus intrusion. Individual versus machine. That framing is familiar, almost comfortable. It gives everyone clear roles. But once Chelsy Davy's messages entered the record, that clarity dissolved. Because now the court is holding two truths at the same time. And holding two truths is always harder than choosing one. The first truth: the press pursued Harry aggressively, sometimes unlawfully. They tracked, speculated, intruded. They turned relationships into content. They caused harm. The second truth: Harry's private emotional life did not align neatly with the public narrative he later presented. His relationships were already strained, already complicated, already marked by suspicion and withdrawal. Before the press could plausibly be blamed for everything, neither truth cancels the other. But together, they undermine the simplicity on which his case relies. As proceedings continue, the legal teams return to technicalities: dates, articles, evidence chains, the mechanics of information gathering. On paper, that's what this case is about. But everyone in the room knows the emotional gravity has shifted. Harry's testimony is still compelling. His descriptions of paranoia still resonate. His fear still feels real. But now those emotions are contextualized differently. They are no longer just responses to external pressure. They are patterns, and patterns invite interpretation. Harry describes becoming hypervigilant. He says he felt he had to protect himself and those around him. that every interaction carried risk. That trust became conditional. But conditional trust changes relationships in predictable ways. It creates distance. It breeds misinterpretation. It turns reassurance into suspicion. And suspicion, once normalized, doesn't wait for proof. The court doesn't accuse Harry of causing his own suffering. That would be crude. Instead, it listens as his own words outline a psychological environment where withdrawal became a default response. That environment didn't begin with Meghan. It didn't end with Chelsy. It wasn't isolated to one relationship or one period. It was persistent, and persistence matters. Because the snowball effect Harry describes now appears to operate internally as much as externally. Fear accumulates. Doubt compounds. Emotional shortcuts become habits. Calling someone a rebound is not just a remark. It's a distancing mechanism. A way to keep emotional stakes low. To protect against disappointment. Seen in isolation, it's nothing. Seen in sequence, it's something else. And that's what the court is quietly assembling now. A sequence. Not a condemnation. A pattern. As observers, you can feel the discomfort grow. Not because Harry is being attacked, but because the story he has told so often, so confidently, is no longer the only one in the room. Chelsy Davy's role in this is still misunderstood by many watching from the outside. She is not positioned as an antagonist. She hasn't given interviews. She hasn't spoken publicly. She has simply allowed the record to include her side, indirectly, through preserved communication. That restraint matters. Because it signals intent. This isn't revenge. It's correction. For years, Harry's narrative about their relationship has circulated without challenge. That narrative framed her as someone overwhelmed by press intrusion, unable to cope with the royal spotlight. There's truth in that, but it wasn't the whole truth. And once Harry placed that relationship at the center of a legal claim, the partial truth became a problem. Chelsy didn't contradict his pain. She contextualized it. She didn't deny the press intrusion. She revealed parallel dynamics that existed alongside it. And that parallelism is devastating to simplistic arguments. The court is not there to adjudicate emotional blame. But credibility is always on trial in cases like this. Not credibility in the sense of honesty versus dishonesty. Credibility in the sense of proportionality. Is the harm described proportional to the cause identified? Or are there additional variables that have been conveniently omitted? As this question hangs in the air, Harry's testimony subtly evolves. He becomes more reflective, more nuanced. He acknowledges complexity more openly. That evolution is human. It's what happens when someone realizes their story has reached the limits of its own coherence. But it also signals something else. Control is slipping. Not dramatically, not catastrophically. Narrative control. For years, Harry has been the architect of his own story. Through interviews, documentaries, speeches, and court filings, he has shaped a consistent arc. Persecution, awakening, escape. That arc has power. It mobilizes sympathy. It creates moral clarity. But arcs depend on selective emphasis. They smooth over contradictions. They compress time. They turn ambivalence into destiny. The texts don't shatter that arc. They roughen it. They introduce friction. They remind everyone that before the story was polished, it was lived unevenly. That reminder doesn't sit comfortably in a courtroom where clean causality is prized. And it certainly doesn't sit comfortably with an audience conditioned to see Harry as a figure of moral certainty. What emerges instead is something less flattering, but more believable. A man deeply wounded by intrusion. A man who learned to preempt pain by disengaging. A man whose fear of being hurt shaped how he loved and how he left. None of that absolves the press. But it does redistribute responsibility. And redistribution is threatening. Because it challenges the idea that harm is always imposed from the outside. Sometimes it's internalized. Sometimes it's reproduced. Sometimes it's passed along, unintentionally, to the people closest to you. As the court continues to hear evidence, the legal arguments regain prominence. There are discussions of surveillance, of tracking, of alleged unlawful techniques used by associated newspapers. Those matters are serious. They will be weighed carefully. But the emotional verdict has already shifted. Not against Harry. Away from certainty. And uncertainty is corrosive to advocacy. Harry's case depends on a clear moral through line. On the idea that his suffering has a singular, identifiable cause. The texts complicate that. They don't deny suffering. They deny singularity. And singularity is easier to litigate than complexity. As days pass, journalists in the courtroom begin to frame their coverage differently. Less focus on villainy, more on nuance. Less on outrage, more on contradiction. That's not an accident. Stories follow gravity. And the gravitational center of this case is no longer the press. It's narrative credibility. The realization dawns slowly, but unmistakably. This case may succeed legally and still fail narratively. Harry could win damages and lose clarity. He could prove unlawful behavior and still expose his own vulnerability to scrutiny. Because once you invite intimacy into a legal forum, you don't get to decide which parts of it matter. Intimacy resists curation. It insists on being seen whole. And the audience senses this. They begin to ask questions that extend beyond the courtroom. If Harry's fear of the press reshaped his emotional behavior so profoundly, what does that say about the limits of blame? If trauma explains, but does not excuse, where does responsibility rest? And if private words can undermine public narratives so effectively, how many other stories are similarly fragile? These questions don't need answers to have impact. They linger. They unsettle. They reframe. And perhaps most importantly, they humanize. Because what the texts ultimately reveal is not duplicity, but defense. A man trying to stay ahead of pain. A man minimizing attachment to protect himself. A man who didn't realize that those defenses would one day be read back to him under oath. That realization, that your private coping mechanisms have become public evidence, is devastating. And you can see it in Harry's demeanor as the case progresses. Not shame. Exposure. Exposure is different. Shame is about wrongdoing. Exposure is about being seen without armor. And armor has been central to Harry's public role. The warrior against the press. The protector of privacy. The man who draws clear lines. Exposure blurs those lines. It reveals hesitation. It reveals contradiction. It reveals a person still figuring things out, even now. As this chapter of the case draws to a close, no one announces a turning point. But everyone feels it. This is no longer a story about whether the press behaved badly. It's a story about whether a man's explanation for his own past can survive contact with preserved reality. And preserved reality is unforgiving. It doesn't care about intention. It doesn't adjust for hindsight. It simply exists. The texts exist. The patterns exist. The ambiguity exists. And once they exist in the public record, they change everything that follows. Because the next phase of this story is not about relationships, or even about the press. It's about consequences. How narratives fracture. How authority erodes. How a public figure responds when the story they've told for years begins to tell itself back, differently. That response hasn't fully played out yet. But the direction is clear. The era of clean storytelling is over. And what replaces it will not be nearly as comfortable. What comes after exposure is never apology. Not immediately. It's recalibration. That's the phase the court enters next, and it's the most revealing one, precisely because it isn't dramatic. No one raises their voice. No one storms out. There's no theatrical reversal. Instead, there's a subtle tightening around language, around certainty, around how far anyone is willing to go. This is where consequences begin to form. Not verdicts. Not judgments. Consequences. They show up in what lawyers stop asking. In what witnesses stop asserting, in how arguments are framed more carefully, more narrowly, as if everyone has realized that the terrain is less stable than they thought. Up to this point, Harry's case has leaned heavily on moral force, on the idea that what happened to him was so egregious, so invasive, that it eclipsed everything else, that the press was the dominant actor, the primary cause, the central villain. That framing still exists, but it's no longer uncontested. And once a story becomes contested, it behaves differently. The court begins to narrow its focus. There's less appetite for sweeping claims about emotional devastation, more interest in specific instances of alleged unlawful behavior. Dates, methods, proof. This is not accidental. It's defensive, because broad emotional narratives invite scrutiny. Narrow legal arguments contain it. Harry's legal team senses the shift. They pivot subtly. They emphasize evidence that doesn't rely on personal relationships. They lean into documentation, into process, into what can be verified without opening another layer of private life. That pivot tells you something important. They know the relational argument has reached its limit. Not because it's false, but because it's vulnerable. The texts didn't disprove Harry's suffering. They complicated the explanation for it. And in law, complication is dangerous. It creates room for doubt, for alternative causation, for partial responsibility. So the case contracts. But outside the courtroom, the story expands. Because while the law moves toward specificity, the public narrative is doing the opposite. It's zooming out, looking for meaning, asking what this moment says about something larger, about narrative control, about authority, about what happens when a public figure's private archive intrudes on their public identity. For years, Harry's authority has rested on one central claim: that he sees clearly what others refuse to acknowledge, that he understands the machinery of harm because he has lived inside it, that his story is not just personal, but instructive. That authority depends on coherence, not perfection, coherence. And coherence is what begins to fray when private words introduce alternative readings. It's not that Harry lied. That's too blunt. It's that he selected. He selected which parts of his experience to emphasize, which dynamics to foreground, which explanations to privilege. Again, that's human. Everyone does it. But when you build a public identity on truth-telling, selection becomes a liability. Because others may remember what you've forgotten, or preserve what you moved past, or simply refuse to